This is more experimental and we're very excited for this. When are you going to release this podcast? We've gotten some funding from GSMA, which is one of the kind of big telco associations. And we're very excited to be building what we see as the future of voice assistants on mobile apps.
Welcome to Agentic Thinkers. I'm your host, Matt Elsey. In this podcast, we talk to the founders and CTOs and leaders actually building agentic AI, the real systems. We cover design, governance, and hard lessons of scaling in production. If you want the reality of agentic AI in the enterprise, hit subscribe. We're just getting started. So, welcome to Youcef Rahmani from ToumAI. ToumAI builds culturally and linguistically aware voice AI that enables organizations to engage customers in both global and local languages, making services more natural, accessible, and inclusive. Youcef, welcome.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thanks for having me.
So you've got a bit of an interesting background in the fact that you actually come from law, sustainable law, and now you've obviously got into the startup business, into AI, and you've set up ToumAI. It would be great to understand a bit more about that journey and any sort of mental shift that you've had to make transitioning from that sort of corporate law environment over to the AI founder startup.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit atypical. I grew up in London. I sort of moved around a bit. I studied philosophy in undergrad, so it wasn't even law related. I actually studied languages in undergrad as well. So I think that's where the initial link was made, because I studied Arabic. So the story is that my my parents, so my dad's Algerian, and he sort of moved to London when he was young, for a better life. And, growing up, my mum's French, so she doesn't speak Arabic. And growing up, at home, we would speak mainly in French because my dad also speaks French. But my dad wouldn't really talk to us in sort of his Algerian Arabic. And one of the reasons that he would say at the time was that Algerian Arabic isn't a real language. It's more like a sort of patchwork of different, influences, and there's a bit of Arabic, but there's a bit of French, and it's all a bit broken, and they don't conjugate verbs properly and all that stuff. And that was, that's your first introduction kind of to the life of like growing up as sort of, I'm a Londoner, but at the same time I've got those roots, and you're always curious about where you come from. So when I went into undergrad, I was very curious to sort of learn more about Arabic. But one of the things with Arabic, and it's the case with a lot of other languages, and we'll get into this maybe later on, but is that you tend to have like the formal version of the language, which from a kind of literary perspective is the one that's lauded the most. That's the one that if you speak it that way, you're a very good speaker of that language. But then you tend to have a lot of kind of regional dialects. So some people don't like the word dialect, and I think it's a protest actually against this kind of feeling initially that my dad also had growing up, because the idea behind the word dialect is that you're speaking a kind of version of that language that is a kind of knockoff, or like the wrong way of speaking the language, right? But what's interesting is that with Arabic, you've got that across the different Arabic speaking countries. So anyway, I was interested in learning Arabic, but obviously when I started learning it in my undergrad, I realized that the Arabic I was learning obviously was formal Arabic, which I loved as well. Is super, super useful. You can read books, you can read literature, you connect to that culture as well, just differently than, if I were actually learning the Algerian version of Arabic. Anyway, that was great. I sort of finished my studies there, and I was like, okay, do I want to become a philosophy professor or a, linguist? And not so much. So I thought, I'd like to get like a proper, quote unquote, professional skill, a trade, so to speak. So yeah, I went on to study law, in my master's. I went back to Paris actually. So I did my undergrad in Canada, moved to Paris and studied law there. I joined a program that actually allowed you to join directly at a master's level, kind of like what you'd have in the UK with the GDL, like conversion courses. So I did that. It was about 3 years because I had a gap year where I worked in law firms. After that, I've always been a bit academically minded. So, I was like, this was good, but I want more knowledge of like finance. So I actually went to Oxford and did a second master's called like the Masters in Law and Finance. But what was interesting is when I was there, that's when I started getting interested in like the whole tech scene. It was kind of around the time I was there in like 2018. So it was kind of around the time when blockchain and like cryptos were it was still relatively new, but they were blowing up. There was a lot of talk around DLT and all of these like distributed ledgers and all that stuff. So I sort of got interested in that. I had a couple of colleagues, in the same class as myself, who were also interested in that. So we kind of joined this student club called the Oxford FinTech and Legal Tech Society, and we did a bunch of hackathons. Um, it's also where I met a couple of other future founders that I think some of you've actually interviewed as well. So there's that link there. So yeah, I sort of, that was my first introduction to the kind of tech world, even though I was doing a second law program. So I start the PhD in about less than a year in. I So I was in contact with like a couple of people that I had met when I was in Casablanca that were also sort of working around tech. And actually, the story is that when I was actually working in the firm, one of our, I guess they weren't the clients, but they were sort of one of the parties involved in the transaction. It was a very big transaction. There were many sleepless nights on calls trying to close the deal. And one of the persons who was on this deal on like the investment banking side, she sort of called me and was like, "Oh, my partner is actually working on a startup right now, and they're kind of working on natural language processing, but the specificity is that they're doing it on local languages like Moroccan Arabic, etc." This was all before ChatGPT, right? So it's like a precursor where we're still working on, I'm not going to get too technical, but like, transformers and like kind of more fundamental models.
Did you have much awareness of the LLMs and the transformer models beforehand, or was this
myself? Not too much.
Right. Okay.
A little bit. We had, when I was at Oxford, we had, one of the hackathons, we had actually built like a chatbot using TensorFlow, on WhatsApp. It was actually one of the kind of my colleagues, very smart person who was with us in the cohort, and she was already dabbling in all of this like, early AI stuff that was coming out, and it was very impressive at the time, because I remember we had showcased that at one of the hackathons, where basically the point was you were a tourist. You needed to ask a question about like, where do I need to go if my handbag's been stolen, right, in a foreign country? And the bot would essentially, on the basis of some kind of database that we gave it, tell you, well, okay, you're in, Spain, and so this is how the process works in Spain if you want to get a complaint through to the police, and this is what the police would do, and this is where you could go, and etc. It was actually quite advanced for the time as well, and people were very impressed. So I did have some notion of like the technology and stuff, but I wasn't yet like fully acquainted,
because you're more on the business side anyway now. I mean, you're the COO of ToumAI, right? So I think you know a lot about the tech. Is not your background, I guess, from what you talked about. And there's been a bit of a shift into being surrounded by techies everywhere talking about AI. I can imagine that's it's been a bit of adaptation from law into that. Has that been a difficult transition, or have you just found it fairly?
So I mean, it's also maybe a personality thing. I'm quite a curious person. I like to sort of, in a way, I'm like a generalist. Like that was one of the issues I had with law, is that at some point I felt like, I wasn't an absolute expert yet. And, I'm not saying, lawyers who spend their whole life doing what they do, they become very good at what they do. But that wasn't really how I saw myself moving forward in life. I sort of wanted to try different things and just learn about new things. So, going into the tech space, I was super curious. So I love talking to like tech people, especially techie people who can actually sometimes like explain in plainer language what they're doing. And I'd also do a bit of research myself. And I think, that's become sort of what I do to a certain extent in the company. I don't have a sales profile. I don't have a tech profile, but I end up on a lot of customer discovery calls or
Right.
whatever, explaining the tech in very simple terms to, business units that are not necessarily techie as well, but they have business problems that need to be solved. And so they need to understand high level, the intuitions behind how the tech works.
So is that bridging the gap we struggle
Yeah.
with a lot with sort of machine learning and
Right.
deep learning neural networks compared to what can this do for my
Exactly.
business and what the real world sort of problems it's solving. I mean, I love the fact that there's a personal sort of fundamental principle here to what you're doing around the languages. And I think where you described it, it's almost like a sort of a sense of isolation maybe of people that are non-English speakers. I mean, AI has been built around English models, right? The models are all sort of US centric, as we often joke about in the UK with the sort of Americanisms, but also it's very English centric. But what you're talking about is the fact that, you've had exposure to these different languages and different cultures whereby there's whole swathes of people that are kind of locked out unless they can then move to English speaking, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that you've experienced yourself as a sort of, having moved around the world in different areas. I mean, you speak a lot of languages anyway, but I don't know if you want to sort of just talk a bit about the opportunity that you saw there.
Yeah, for sure. So initially, right, we had this tech, as I was saying, the NLP around. So what it could do is it was very simple. It was mainly like sentiment analysis on text. But the innovation at the time was that the model that had been built by, one of my co-founders and that we kind of got, built the company around, was that AI models at that time, the kind of sentiment analytics and these kinds of models, they really struggled to essentially do that kind of task on anything other than English, maybe French. One of the specificities, for example, with a lot of these dialects when they're written is that Moroccan Arabic, for example, could be written in the could be written in the Arabic characters because it's Arabic.
Mm-hmm.
If it is, it's not going to follow standard Arabic grammatical rules. So if you've got a model that's just been trained on formal Arabic, it's going to be off.
Right.
And at the same time, in practice, what really happened, if you go onto social media and you see on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, like how Moroccans, when they write in Moroccan Arabic, how they write, and this is the case actually across the region, is that generally they will actually use a lot of times Latin script to write in Arabic. And you'll see the same thing with Urdu in Pakistan and, a lot of that stuff where they'll use the Latin script, but then for certain sounds that don't exist in a Latin script, they will replace them with numbers. And so you end up, if you're not if you don't know how to read that, you're just, you're Matt, right? And you're looking at this script, you're just going to see stuff like 5, ALQ, and you're like, how on earth do I read this? Like, what is this?
Yeah.
And an AI model is even dumber, right? Like it's not going to be able to process that at all.
Yeah.
And so we were thinking, wow, okay, so actually there's a whole market here of, measuring what people are saying and like sentiment analytics on social media. So like the whole kind of social media listening market, right? Which was already quite a big thing at the time. You're missing out basically on 3 billion native speakers of essentially other languages than English or French or some of the mainstream ones. And so we thought, okay, well, that in itself is already quite an interesting market opportunity because if we have models that can actually do that sentiment analysis on these more niche languages, and we've got a streamlined way of, extending that to other languages as well, then, we're opening up an entire market, right?
Yeah.
So that was, and, one of the things that we were thinking in terms of application for this was we could help companies do surveys at scale with native speakers and of these local areas, and they could answer in their native language, right? They don't need to be like translated, or you don't need to ask them in French or in English. They can just answer. And so I was already thinking, okay, this is a sustainability thing that we're also solving from a social aspect, because now we're starting to include their voices, whereas before you know, these consultants
excluded.
or they would get like a person to go and talk to like 10 of them, and then write something down and then it gets lost in translation somewhere.
And you're right, sentiment analysis is such a big thing, especially in customer service and these sort of like surveys that go out there, that you're losing so much telemetry and information as a result, right? And
Yeah.
when I had a quick question, so people mix languages, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I mentioned to you, I grew up in the Middle East, so I see people mix Arabic with English all the time and sort of do that sort of hybrid. In fact, it happens all the time. In DeepSeek model, for example, there's a lot of press about it mixing Chinese with English just in its responses. How do you handle that kind of mixed dialect, or do you need people to sort of stick to one dialect, and can you switch between the two easily? How does that get handled?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So this problem that you're speaking about, in technical terms, we call it code switching.
Okay.
So it's essentially where, and it happens a lot, as you said, in Morocco, for example, with the French influence, in Algeria too, like, you'll be speaking and all of a sudden you'll use a French word, or you're going to switch and you'll use like a Spanish word, or you'll use like a local Berber word for something, And so in some respects, that's why someone from Egypt, from Jordan, hearing a Moroccan speaking for the first time is going to have a very hard time understanding what they're saying because of that. Like they need to sort of get used to that vocabulary. And so that's absolutely correct. Like one of the things that we were working on very early on was how do we solve the code switching problem? Because most models at the time, it's different now, but at the time they were monolinguistic,
Right.
meaning that they could only deal with one language at a time. So typically, we moved on to voice, right? So we can get into that later, but essentially the ChatGPT moment happened. Everyone was like, oh, these LLMs, and everyone's starting to like try and build stuff with LLMs. And in a way, it kind of meant it was a huge opportunity for us because yes, it meant that we didn't have to build those models ourselves from scratch. We had pre-trained models now that we could leverage. But it meant we could just go a lot faster on the stuff that actually mattered. And so we were thinking, well, the voice component is actually like so important because a lot of people in these regions, that's culturally also how they prefer to express themselves is going to be like through voice.
So there was almost an aha moment there where you've been working on text based, and then, I mean, IVRs, or intelligent voice recognition, has been sort of like it's come fairly recently, relatively recently, where it's capable. So did that happen when you were looking at this and you were kind of like, oh, hang on, this is an even bigger opportunity for us? And it's suddenly,
yeah, because what we were realizing was that written surveys is good, but when you can conduct business operations through voice. So I'll give you an example. And this is one of the business cases that we worked on, but like, we're working with a telco in one of the North African countries. And, one of the things that they need is, well, they have some customers who are on a phone plan and they have to pay every month. Okay. And sometimes they forget to pay, right? And so there's a bit of delay on when they pay. And so they have a team in their customer recovery team, literally their job, and they're humans, right? And their job is to call customers who are within a kind of 3-day window period where they still haven't paid, and then the deadline was passed, where they just call them and tell them, hey, whatever, Mohammed or Omar or whatever your name is, so they personalize it, it's important. Just to let you know, a friendly call, just let you know you were supposed to pay your phone plan, you didn't, we don't want to cut your line off. Do you think you'll be able to pay by the end of the week, right? It's friendly, but it's a way for them. Oftentimes customers going to say, oh yeah, I'm really sorry, I'm getting paid soon and I just forgot and I had to, recredit my account and I didn't, or whatever, like a whole bunch of reasons for why they didn't pay, right? And so what that does is that it increases the retention. You don't lose customers. If you wait too long, the customer's not going to pay, and then it's going to start becoming like litigation, or maybe not, but the line's going to get cut and then the customer's gone. And so what they realized was if they sent a text message to these customers, the conversion rate, i.e. the rate at which the customer is going to say, oh yeah, sorry, I'm going to pay, is only 3%. But when they called them, the rate goes up to like 30-40%.
Oh, wow. Right.
So it's a huge difference.
Yeah.
And so, and that's just one example, but like voice solutions have such a big potential because they feel more personal. You're kind of calling the person. And especially in these regions, and this is a big point with dialects and kind of local languages, is that they're spoken, right? They're spoken languages. Yes, you can write them in text, and people do that. And people do write comments on social media sometimes, especially in like local groups in these languages.
Yeah.
But they're spoken languages, right? And that's one of the reasons why there are no grammatical rules. They're just constantly evolving because they're dynamic languages, right?
That's interesting. So do you, I mean, just on that point, do you think,
Yeah.
given that spoken is so important and that's a natural, I mean, it is for us all, right? But as you say rightly, in some of these regions, that's more the case. Do you see a way where we start to push an envelope from, I mean, from your back, contracts, billing, and maybe, you know, taking out a loan, for example, purely over voice and not actually defaulting back to text, documents, contracts and stuff? How far do you think that could be pushed, that envelope be pushed? I guess I'm leaning on your legal background as well for a bit of a view there.
It's a good question. So actually, it's something we think about a lot at the company. You know, to what extent can we turn or can we transform customer journeys from oftentimes written or tap journeys on phones or whatever to completely kind of spoken journeys? Obviously, the first question you have to ask yourself is that what people want?
True.
Right. I think that's cultural. There are some numbers. I think EY actually came out recently with a study that was quite interesting on that. It's a generational thing as well. There's a lot going on. But, you know, in Africa, in a lot of these emerging markets, voice is just the preferred mode of communication. If you open, I remember actually I was having one time a conversation with like one of the taxi drivers in Morocco, right? And like, you know, he was telling me, yeah, like if you ask anybody in Morocco right now, like the random guy on the street, like the guy in his grocery store, you know, the mother, you know, whatever, like anyone, if you ask them, show me your WhatsApp messages, and they showed you, you would only see voice notes.
Yeah.
You wouldn't see text.
Yeah.
So there's an interesting like preference in a lot of these regions for voice. Now, going to your question, does that mean that we can quote unquote vocalize any type of journey? I don't think so.
Yeah.
But I think that, as always with contracts, and this is the lawyer side coming in, there's what's written and, you know, what you sign, and essentially basically an archive that you can go back to. So you do need it to be sort of written and stuff. But then there's all of the consumer information, right? And this has been a big theme, you know, when it comes to contracts, especially for consumer, which is like, when you get your consumers to sign contracts, to what extent are they properly informed on what they're signing? And you can't, because they're consumers, right? You can't assume they're sophisticated enough to read all of the fine print on a contract and make an informed decision, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, you could very much have journeys where all of that heavy lifting work is done through personalized voice journeys. Obviously, you would need traceability, and we'll get to that. That's something we're working on, where we actually can keep logs of discussions, but there's privacy element to that as well that, you know, we have to deal with, and, you know, happy to discuss that as well.
We'll get onto that.
But you do need that traceability to make sure that, you know, you know what's going on. So that kind of human in the loop or kind of supervision side of things. But then if you can get that heavy lifting done through voice, then, you know, financial education, all of that stuff that, you know, people, you know, it's so important, like financial education that leads to financial inclusion, digital inclusion, you know, where people don't use digital services because they're not comfortable with the way the app works or they don't trust it. And the problem is we're moving in a world where everything's becoming digitalized. And so if you're not comfortable with that, you are going to be left out at some point.
Because there was a comment you made actually when we were talking earlier around multimodal models actually being more of the future. There's a school of thought that, you know, text-based LLMs, chat-based, is actually just, you know, underserved really. If you move into multimodal, suddenly you've got all this other information from voice to you know, vision, and feeding that into a model, suddenly you open up more opportunity, right?
Absolutely. So we actually worked on a use case at ToumAI with one of our customers. This was kind of a bit more on the R&D side, but we did it because it just looked like an amazing opportunity, and I think it is, that speaks to your point, where so essentially this is in the context of cars, and one of the questions, is, well, we want to build cars that are safe for drivers, and they're like the cars of the future, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what does the car of the future do? Well, maybe it understands drivers. How does it understand drivers? Okay, so drivers can talk to the car to get stuff done. Okay. Can the car see the driver's facial expressions so that it can actually anticipate if the driver's furious? The driver's got road rage. Okay, maybe the car can do something like limit the speed, or there's some triggers, right, that might happen. So we're going into that agentic route where there's something that's triggering an entire process in that machine, right?
Yeah.
What we worked on specifically was emotion. So one of the things that this company was telling us was, if you have text, you can do sentiment analysis on the text based on the words that are employed, right?
Yeah.
But then oftentimes actually, the way we say things, that's actually going to be super important, right? Because your tone is actually going to also, you as a human, when I say a sentence to you, you're not just evaluating the general emotion by looking at the content. You're also listening for cues. You're looking at body language. You're doing all these things. An LLM doesn't do that, right? An LLM just looks at the text. So what we started working on was, and as you said in your intro, at ToumAI, one of our kind of big things is to be culturally and linguistically aware.
Uh-huh.
And so this was a really good case for us, because typically the customer, what they were saying was, well, we need a model that can feed into a kind of text-based model, but it's actually a model that evaluates tone of voice.
Right.
And the issue with tone is that if you are Japanese, the way that you express certain emotions will not be exactly the same way as someone from Senegal or as someone from the US, just as an example.
Yeah.
And so it becomes very, very, very kind of locally important, where you need that local sensitivity, that kind of cultural sensitivity, to understand what irony is, what anger is, what happiness is, what surprise is. And then these things can tie into real business cases where...
So I mean, just on that problem as a whole, I mean, what you're talking about is basically localization. So we're used to these big LLMs, one size fits all, foundational frontier models that everyone's sort of using. But when we start to get to local dialects, I guess there's a need to then train these things locally and sort of overlay it, and then start to, because it's so subjective, is there challenges around training these things and giving it feedback, like reinforcement learning and such, to get it right? Is that an ongoing process?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah. So one of the challenges we had with this use case specifically was that when you're kind of getting your data set, right? So firstly, there's a huge work that goes into data labeling, like firstly sourcing the data. Like, how are you going to do this? Do you get people to simulate emotions in a studio?
Wow,
do you get videos off of internet? How do you do this, right? And there's issues with each method. If you do a studio, and we did try, right? We actually did some of that. The issue is that the emotions tend to be exaggerated. They're not real life emotions. So your model is a bit skewed.
Yeah.
If you go on, YouTube or whatever, and you start scraping audios or, stuff like that, same thing. Like, generally speaking, right, content creation tends to be quite exaggerated. Because you want to create strong emotions. And so, we were actually confronted, and we had this was a project where we had a very short timeline for a lot of different reasons. So we actually had to get something out within a month. So we had a month to build like a first version, a month or two, let's say, to build the first version of this model. And it was very challenging.
With no training data, essentially.
Yeah, you have to build it more or less from scratch, because I can't say too much about it, but the language was quite neat. I mean, it was relatively niche. It wasn't you know, super niche, but it was not, I'd say, like a mainstream language like English.
Right.
And there was no model out there, that existed. LLMs are not, they're just not trained on that stuff. So yeah, we were completely in sort of new territory. It was a really good experience, and we're still building on top of that to this day, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And you're expanding the dialects, I guess, a lot at the moment. I mean, I'm just thinking of the fact that you're dealing with underrepresented languages, which is fantastic because, again, you're just opening up a big market there and also giving those people representation where they wouldn't have had it before, and the ability to leverage, you know, the advances of AI. But I would imagine there's also, I mean, I'm not sort of, my Scottish and Irish friends don't sort of take the wrong way, but you know, there's lots of strong dialects in any language in the UK. Correct. Even in France, I know that there's very different dialects, and we've already talked about Arabic and the varying dialects of Arabic you have. I mean, there's huge potential even within, you know, markets that are here closer to home for this technology, right?
Absolutely. And this is where it became super interesting for us, because initially when we started, we were kind of branded, you know, Africa / emerging markets, because that's where we thought, you know, that's the market, right? As we started moving into everything we've discussed, right, the whole kind of, you know, transcribing speech, generating speech, so speech to text, but then text to speech, where you have to get the accent right, but also emotion, tonality, right? When you start getting into these, you realize that actually the problem that we're solving, exactly as you said, is not specific to just dialects. It becomes also very relevant for places where you just actually in general, where you just have accents. And I remember talking to, I had at one point I was like in Luxembourg for like a conference thing. And I was with this super nice guy. He was Dutch and he was working in Luxembourg. And he had a connected car. He was a big car guy, and he was like, yeah, you know, my car actually, you know, I can talk to my car. But he's telling me the issue is that my car only understands English, and I've got a Dutch accent when I speak English. And by the way, Dutch accents in English are like probably some of the best like quote unquote best for in terms of like they're quite clear, and they're not that strong. You know, I'm not saying this negatively, but just as an example. And he was telling me even with that, the car couldn't understand me. Like I'd have to sort of simulate like an American or maybe a British accent for it to actually understand what I was saying. And so, and so we actually started talking to a lot of European companies where they were telling us, guys, what you're working on is actually so relevant to some of the business problems we have, because we've got accents, we've got all of these things. In Germany, you've got different German depending on where you are in Germany. In Belgium, you've got like 2-3 languages that are spoken, and there's a lot of politics around the language. And, you know, you start getting into all of this, as you said, you know, in the UK, you've got pretty strong accents across, you know, the geography, right? And you need to include everyone. Like, there's no reason that someone who has a stronger, you know, Welsh or, you know, whatever Scottish accent, you know, shouldn't be able to use these tools in the same way as someone from London. And so that's where, you know, the market really opens up.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What, like, with your organisation, like, do you compare or come up against places like Gradient Labs and DeepL and
Absolutely.
11 Labs, I think.
Yeah.
Another one. Is that like, would they be competitors to you then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We didn't set out to be like an 11 Labs, just because we didn't see ourselves as being a pure tech company that's just building APIs and then selling it to others who are going to solve business problems. From the onset, we were saying to ourselves, we want to use this tech to solve business problems immediately, right? And so initially when we started, we actually used all types of models. We weren't necessarily creating in-house models ourselves. We were just tweaking them. So, you know, we never built an LLM. You have other companies in Africa. Some of them actually, you know, they kind of had the same ethos as ours in terms of languages, but their approach was, we're going to build like a native, you know, Zulu LLM, which is great. Like, you know, I think that's actually amazing. But that wasn't our ambition for multiple reasons. So we were actually quite opportunistic, where we were thinking, well, we've got a team of data scientists and stuff, and they understand how these models work. They can tweak them so that, I don't want to be spilling too much of the secret sauce, but, we found a way of like using models that, might have, for example, Arabic or French or whatever, like in terms, reasoning through families of languages. And then we can like do certain tweaks. We can like retrain it a bit, do some reinforcement learning.
Is that the compound AI concept you're talking
A little bit. Yeah, a little bit.
Does that give you more adaptability and a speed to response to new markets than just investing all your eggs in one basket and going deep on a dedicated LLM?
Yeah, so our philosophy, and it's going to answer both of your question, our philosophy was we want to bring business value as fast as possible, right? And if we start doing what 11 Labs did, it's going to take a little bit of time in terms of R&D. You start worrying about things that are like very tech related, like am I crushing my latency? Does it sound very human and very realistic, right? Which is great. But we didn't want that to be the problem that we were solving. We wanted the problem that we were solving to be, am I allowing this organization to now receive calls in Moroccan Arabic through their IVR so that customers could, instead of waiting 5 minutes to talk to an agent in 1 minute, or get like a business response in 1 minute. And so we did have to do trade-offs where sometimes we'd use models, at 11 Labs, whatever, like whatever models that worked, Gradient, there are a few others like DeepGram and, all these companies, some of them. So we were just looking at benchmarks. We didn't want to play the benchmark game. We didn't want to have like a ToumAI, these are all the other guys and here's the ToumAI benchmark, right? We didn't want to play that. We were more kind of like, let's use the models that are the best at the moment. And then it's going to be a business discussion with the customer where we'll say, look, it's also a pricing issue. 11 Labs is quite expensive, to be honest. It's very good for certain contexts, but maybe for certain calls that you're making, it's okay to have a robotic voice. You might not need to have a super realistic human voice. And a lot of customers, you're able to convince them around that because you've got business logic that come in and they've got a pressing issue they need to solve. And so it doesn't matter if latency is a little bit high on certain use cases. Obviously, on some it does. So yeah, we kind of played around a lot with that.
Are you? So if we're gonna, do you want to? I don't know if this comes out. No. I mean, does it come out? Does your voice come out? So this conversation, is it?
Yes, I might pick it up in the background.
This is why you need to be sat over there, really.
Yeah.
This proves my point. Yeah, but it's a good question, right? Yeah. And the fact you're sat behind there and not sat over here means.
It's that Jamie effect from Rogan, Yeah,
he's Jamie, the voice from the side. Now you're just talking to someone off screen. It's like, what's going on here? No, you haven't. No, it's just.
No, it was a good question.
No. It's coming, Reese. You know it is.
I'm gutted. I'm not the one that brought you here.
Teasing him out. So, look. ToumAI, I said it wrong probably because you pronounce it very differently.
Yeah.
If you Google it, it comes up with fossils and all sorts. Tell me a bit about that. So if people look up ToumAI, they're kind of aware of the history of it.
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting you say that actually. Most of our investors, customers, when they come across us initially, they're actually going to say ToumAI. So we're quite used to that as well.
Right. Sorry.
Initially, you're right. Like the choice of the name was ToumAI, and ToumAI was the name given to one of the kind of first human skulls found in Chad. And the meaning of ToumAI, so it's from the Dizaga language in Chad, which is a local language.
Right.
And it means, I guess in English, it would translate something like hope for life.
Wow.
And, we took that name because we thought Africa, that kind of, the birth of humanity, quote unquote, maybe it's not scientifically correct, but that's sort of the myth.
I'm sure there'll be people that debate that somewhere out there, but
exactly. I don't have a strong opinion on that, but there is that symbolic and the fact that it's hope for life. And, our mission was to kind of create hope, or like to bring inclusivity through AI to these people who are proud of their languages, of their local languages. My dad's proud of his Algerian language, but somehow he still wasn't really willing to speak to me in that language because he thought that's not the language that an educated person would speak.
Wow.
And so, you know, I think the mission here was to kind of bring back that pride and to say, well, you know what, these are actually proper languages that we should be proud of. And,
Yeah.
you know, maybe we don't use them to write grand literature, but
This is,
it's still a language that we use and that carries emotion and history, you know.
history. Yeah.
And, you know, I was thinking the other day, you know, Dante wrote his famous Inferno, you know, the famous book in Italy. And it was one of the first books that was written in vernacular Latin, which
Yeah.
eventually became Italian.
Yeah.
And that kind of set, you know, the pace for how language emerged in the way it did in Europe as well. So
That's so interesting, because it's become more sort of focused on almost holding this corpus of information that starts to represent what we're about, right? Because it will, as we start to store more and more in these models. Humanity is we're just a bunch of storytellers, right? That's how we pass things down. It's all about telling a story. That's why we like stories even now, right? I wonder how much gets lost potentially, and I'm kind of being a bit theoretical here, as we move forward, because you know, the models weren't capable of having it, or because people weren't able to interact in the way to share those stories on it, because it's passed down the generations, right? And what we're saying is, you know, whilst generations will continue to proliferate stories, if we're not storing it in the models, when we train it, then we're losing a whole corpus of history and goodness in cultures and humanity itself.
Yeah.
It was a bit deep, but you see where I mean, it's
so one of the one of the things that I like to kind of bring up when we have this discussion is the Rosetta Stone.
Yeah.
So I'll just sort of remind the viewers, but I'm sure everyone's aware. I think it's in the British Museum, or maybe they moved it back to Egypt. But anyway, it was basically a stone that was found, I think, in the 19th century. Fact check me on that. And what it did was that before finding the stone, we couldn't read hieroglyphs. So they were just sitting there, and you know, people had theories on what they said and how it worked, but no one could really solve or crack the code, so to speak. It was its own language, and no one had the key to the language. And then they found the Rosetta Stone, and interestingly, the Rosetta Stone had 3 sections on it: one in hieroglyphs, one in sort of High Greek, and then one in vernacular Greek. So we, you know, get back to that again.
Yeah.
And so, because you know, the archaeologists could read the Greek, they figured out that it was the same text between the 2 Greeks, and therefore it was safe to assume that it was also the same text in hieroglyph. And so that was what allowed archaeologists and historians to crack the hieroglyph code, and now we can actually read hieroglyphs. And so why do I bring this up? It's because for a lot of these languages, right, these local languages, they don't exist anywhere except in the minds of the people who speak them.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have books written, or not many. I mean, there have now been like more recent initiatives to try and write books in some of these, you know, like Wolof, or, you know, some of these languages and stuff. But historically, they're oral cultures. So as you said, there are many, many, many stories. They're not just languages to like talk about what you're going to eat at lunch. They're like story, you know, they're very rich languages with a lot of stories, but they're all very oral, and they've been passed down. You know, if you look at griots in West Africa, like that's basically, you know, your Homers of back in Greek times, right? They're telling stories of epics and kingdoms and all that stuff in their local languages, in poetry, and, you know, all of that. It's just not written anywhere. And so I'm sure now you have initiatives by, you know, ethnographs, or, you know, these people who try and kind of store that knowledge. But, you know, one of the early missions for us initially was also just, how do we digitize a lot of these local languages, not just in text, but vocally too, right? Working on voice. Because when you write them down, you're already kind of interpreting how they're written, etc. And anyway, you get into debates on that. But then, you know, hieroglyphs, or even Latin, no one really knows how it was pronounced back in the day, because you don't have recordings.
Yeah.
You know, and that's an important feature of humanity and how humanity evolved with language, which there's not just writing, there's also how you would say this, the emotion behind it, etc. You know, you're reading one of Cicero's discourses or rhetoric, but you don't know how he delivered that when he did deliver it.
Yeah.
You can just read it today and kind of imagine how it would have been said. So what we're trying to do now is like there's such a big opportunity to digitize not just the written stuff, but the actual way of saying it as well. And so you're building these digital vocal libraries of these things. And maybe in a way it's setting in stone something that is by nature dynamic, but it's also at least it's creating a kind of Rosetta Stone for future generations as well, in terms of their roots and how, as you said, humanity, how we've evolved, and these very rich languages, and we're trying to keep them alive, essentially.
Yeah. That's it. I think we could talk about this for a long time. I wanted to. It's fascinating, and I love the ethos of what you're doing around that, because for all those reasons, and it's got huge potential. I want to come back to the whole founders, because you've actually got seed funding now, or pre-seeding for your organization, so you've got investors now to start to move this stuff forward really at a rapid pace, which is great. Do you want to just talk a bit about how that came about and what you're doing in that space?
Yeah, for sure. So
I'm bringing this back down to earth here.
Yeah. No, I mean, look, it's actually linked, right? Like at the end of the day, you need capital to be able to, build. There's a lot of kind of discussion around the struggles for sort of African startups to raise funds. We are an African startup because, we've got most of our team based in Morocco. 2 out of the 3 founders are, North African. I mean, I grew up in London, but I've got the roots, some kind of diaspora, I guess, and one of them is actually, Moroccan. The third co-founder is Mediterranean. He's got Italian and roots from the Balkans and stuff. So we've all got that link. But at the same time, we're kind of, European educated or Canadian educated, etc. And so that brings privilege to a certain extent. It allows us to learn and know the codes for how to raise. And I do want to say a short word on this, because one of the things I noticed is that when you're fundraising, you're playing a coded game, right? Like there's a certain way that you talk to investors. There are certain buzzwords, there are certain etiquettes that you sort of learn by watching podcasts and meeting people at events, and kind of, it goes all the way down to like the dress code, right? Like, and I think that, when you grow up in Europe or in the US or whatever, you have a very fast and easy access to that. The fact that I can speak English almost like a native, is such a big factor. And, I've been to events in West Africa, Francophone West Africa, more specifically, Senegal, Togo, and a bunch of other places where you have extremely talented entrepreneurs. Like the stuff they're doing, given where they started from, is so big compared to, what I've done, Oxford, all of that stuff. They're like easy cards that you can play to sort of get interest. I've met some entrepreneurs who've done such amazing jobs, and they've bootstrapped like crazy, and they've built really interesting businesses, and they struggle. And they have a very hard time raising capital because they don't necessarily speak English for a lot of them. Sure, you do have Francophone investors, but you're already reducing the galaxy quite a bit. Moreover, they don't necessarily have these codes, right? They don't have Silicon Valley codes. I mean, they might try and emulate them a little bit because they watch stuff on internet, but they don't really have that. They might have strong accents when they speak. All of that stuff, they're small signals that impact the way a VC, decides on whether to invest or not. Like a VC is not really investing, especially at early stages, is not investing in the robustness of a business. The VC is investing in a team. Is this team going to succeed or not? Full stop. And oftentimes what it ends up being is, do you share common codes with them? Can you reassure them through the way you speak, through your kind of social intelligence, whatever that means. And so, so I just wanted to make that point. I think that, there needs to be some kind of evolution? I think there is. And so I wanted to bring this back to my investors. So we actually have a good mix of corporate venture capital. So in other words, funds that are linked to a big corporate entity that were interested in what we were doing. So, Orange Ventures, one of our investors, shout out to Remy and Faisal and the team. And, they're working on, they do actually invest in Africa because they know that there is that talent there. And we have other investors who are also Africa focused, like Launch Africa. They actually led the round. Amazing investors. They actually really helped us kind of unlock the kind of whole fundraising by really believing in what we were building, which wasn't necessarily easy to explain initially, right? It's quite new, it's quite innovative. I have to say also Go Ventures, they're a smaller investor, but they were actually the very first to believe in what we were doing. They put in a smaller ticket, but it was such an important ticket for us back then because it gave us the backing that we needed at a time when we were struggling a bit to raise. Still, we still haven't quite found how to pitch and how to sort of really kind of get the message out there yet. So yeah, we managed to raise. It was complex because there's that Africa exposure initially, as I said, that we started with. Now we're kind of, I don't want to say we're moving away from that because I think North Africa still remains a market for us that we're actively engaging with, and the rest of Africa too. Actually, it's just that now we're, as I said, seeing a lot more opportunity also in Europe, where they're realizing that this accents and kind of all of that stuff is actually very relevant to problems there as well. So we're kind of now also getting opportunities in Europe. So it kind of makes us a European African startup, more than just a pure African startup.
Because I mean, the regions you've canvassed across, and it's actually far more than other people you speak to. I think I'll make it sort of, the point is blunt. It's hard work, right? Speaking to you, and we had one of our other guests, Emma, was saying this sort of, she called it a 996 sort of hustle culture, where you're working 9 to 9, 6 days a week. Just it's hard, isn't it, to get this stuff raised, to get your idea. And you mentioned there quite interestingly that you needed some sort of investment just to sort of emphasize that what you had was something worth pursuing. Do you have sort of peaks and troughs of where you think, are we onto something here, or is this worth it? You need that encouragement maybe to say that there is beyond what you described earlier, which is obviously linking back to your father, which was underrepresented languages, but you've also got to look at do we have a viable solution here?
I honestly, I think the main source of motivation has got to be the problem that you're solving.
Right.
I think you need to be, and this is something that we really tried to do, which is that we didn't want to just build a solution and then say, our solution's great, come and buy it. We kind of did the opposite, which obviously is kind of best practice, where you try and really figure out the problem and, okay, well, I saw that's a problem, but does everyone else think it's a problem? And so we really went through different cycles of validation on that. And there are different subtleties when it comes to the problems that we're solving that obviously we realized having that discussion. And so I think that's the main source of motivation. Having external approval obviously always helps. I think one problem though is that sometimes there's this kind of narrative that goes around where if you've raised, you've made it. And if you've not raised and you're just bootstrapping, you're a nobody, which is a bit harsh. As I said, I met some incredible founders working in, Senegal and, other places. They haven't raised, and the problem they're solving is real. It might not be $1 billion business. So that's another discussion. And maybe that's why, they can't necessarily raise with VCs. But yeah, I think it's a dangerous game to be in when your source of motivation is that kind of external validation. I'm not saying it's not useful, but you need to be a bit careful.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, you do live roller coasters. Like there are times where I think every founder, has this kind of question of like, why am I putting myself through this? I could just be working an easy, someone said, actually someone used this term the other day and it kind of made me laugh. He told me like, why am I it was another founder and he was telling me like, why am I doing this when I could just have a nice premium job in the city somewhere, like comfy. But at the same time, I think the problem that we're solving is so important to us that, we don't like, we would think that we've sort of not fulfilled our purpose in life, so to speak, if we hadn't at least taken a shot at it. And by the way, I don't think everyone in the world needs to be an entrepreneur. This is also an important thing, right?
Good
And I think
point.
sometimes there's not enough said about that. I don't think everyone in the world is crazy about a problem.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly fine. And I think if everyone in the world had this entrepreneurial mindset, we'd be in big trouble.
Yeah.
So, some people are just really good at stuff and they don't want to have the hassle of being an entrepreneur. Because when you're an entrepreneur, actually, yes, you're solving a problem, but 60% of your time, you're figuring out HR, you're figuring out,
Yeah.
a whole bunch of other things, which are just stuff related to your business, but that you need in order for your business to actually run. And it's not really related to the problem itself. So,
And that's the scale bit, right? I mean, you talk about working with partners and
Yeah.
bigger, corporate giants around getting that scale, because maybe that's not scaling out, maybe isn't what you're looking to. You're innovating, you're trailblazing, you need others to scale. So it's that sort of appropriate horses for courses, as we say, right?
No, exactly. I mean, there's a point where you're scaling, you've sort of hit that, the jargony product market fit, that everyone loves to talk about, which essentially just means you've got a product that people want to buy and at scale. And therefore it means that now you need to start figuring out, how do I start selling in a way that doesn't mean that it's just the founders answering WhatsApp messages all day, right?
Yeah.
Because that's what it is initially. It's
Absolutely.
founder driven sales where you're just constantly answering customers, which is great, but you can't do that at some point when you're really scaling out business. How do you, scale out your product in a way that when you've got hundreds of customers asking you for like specific features, how do you organize that in a rational way? So that now you're confident. So there's a lot of that. And I think that's where people who do have strong corporate experience, who aren't necessarily entrepreneurs, but who have led teams, who are team leaders, who have that strong, they know how to do that part of things, they can actually be better than founders at leading the company to the next stage. I'm not saying it's always the case, but it can be the case.
So you talked a bit about, obviously bringing products to market there. Do you want to just talk a bit about is it holistic CX and
Holistics, yeah.
And you just want to sort of talk a bit about what those products are and where they're at.
Sure, yeah. So, now what we're really focusing on, we've got two pillars to the product. The product's called Holistics. The idea is that you've got customer engagement, customer support happening across lots of different channels. Sometimes there tends to be silos, between teams. If you're in the sales team, if you're in a customer support, if you're in the survey team, oftentimes surveys are like separated from the claims. So you've got call centers dealing with claims, and then you've got surveys done through different channels. And, when we saw that, on the business side, we were thinking that's actually a business problem. Can it be solved easily? I'm not sure, because there's a lot of politics that goes on in big corporations where they kind of want to keep their own, anyway. But, the idea was our product can break silos to a certain extent, where we're kind of unifying a lot of these different channels into one platform, so to speak. So what our product does is, on the one hand, we're building voice agents. Very straightforward. I don't think anyone, has never heard of chatbots and voice bots. I think everyone now has seen that. What we do is that we get voice agents to be kind of a first line of response, oftentimes, across different types of use cases that we've also kind of categorized as well. So, you can have a kind of pre-sales bot that's going to receive leads that come from ads or elsewhere, or organic traffic, for example, on a website. And so people are asking, what are your services, to a company? So like, we've got one customer, they're a real estate promoter. So they've got lots of projects that they're building, and then they sell independent lots to like people who want to buy villas or whatever. And so they've got lots of projects, they've got lots of different budgets. And so, a lead is going to come and either through WhatsApp or through the website. So this is where the multi-channel part comes in.
Right.
They can engage with the bot and say, okay, here's my budget. This is where I'd like to buy. And so they're going to start talking to the bot. The bot's going to start kind of refining the need. So there's a little funnel that happens. And at the end, the guy, the person who's talking to the bot is going to say, okay, yeah, I'm interested. Here are my contacts. I'd like to be contacted by a sales agent. And so what that does is the problem that we're solving here from a business perspective. Obviously, all of this is and can be done in local language. That's, the local language thing.
Yeah.
But also, whereas before you might be wasting your agent's time on very poor quality leads, here you've got that first line with a relatively cheap bot that can do an extra qualification for you so that you know that the leads that are asking to be called back are the ones that have already given a whole bunch of information, and they're that step closer to actually buying the product.
Okay.
And then what happens is, so that's the first kind of product that we have. That was a sales example, but we have it also for customer support. We have it for claims. So yeah, it can deal with different things. And, we build flows where essentially what happens is all of the information, so all of that kind of discussion that happens between the agent and the customer flows onto our back office platform, also Holistics. And that's where we can follow. You can read summaries of all of the kind of transcriptions. You can do analytics. So you can figure out of all the customers that are coming to talk to this real estate promoter, which are the projects that are getting the most hits, or that the people are talking about the most. What are the typical budgets that these people are giving within these different? So we can actually extract all of that from the chats, right? In an anonymized way, but
of course,
very interesting for their teams to kind of know. And then, we're working on, this is where the agentic stuff comes in, where, we can get all this information. What can we then trigger with this information, right? Can you send alerts? Can you start creating personalized pushes? Can you trigger certain actions? So like, for example, one of the things that we're thinking is, well, we've done it low integration for now. But, we could then link that to an existing CRM, and then you start filling in, CRM information. You can also start automating emails that can be sent back to certain customers. I mean, honestly, the horizon's quite limitless. We have to obviously, as a startup, try and focus on the ones that are the highest value. So yeah, that's kind of work ongoing right now.
Wow, quite a bit. There's quite a big topic you're covering there at once. And I think, as you say, it's all about knowing when to act, right? And this is where the power of automation, autonomy comes in from AI, is being able to enact on the right types of information, because there's just so much data. I mean, you talk about call transcripts. I mean, you even look at the transcript of this recording, right? You need to look at the bits that are important and when to take action on those. So that's good. And I mean, as you say, you're sort of integrating with the big players. You're keeping yourself open at the moment, I gather,
Yeah. So, we're addressing, to date, we mainly targeted large enterprise. Initially, the thought was, well, there's that whole kind of call center craze where you put, voice bots onto call centers to do certain types of actions. So, we were kind of into that. There's also chat-based. We still do chat-based, sometimes from a cost perspective, but also just from a pure process perspective. Chatbots are quite efficient for certain use cases, and you don't really need to engage with voice. We had the case of one customer who was, and I think you talk about that, Matt, on some of your podcasts, but like there were some, customers that were like, oh yeah, we want, voice agents that can do all these crazy things. But the use case was actually very straightforward. It didn't actually really need any LLMs. All it was just, they got leads coming in for, essentially this is a company that does car washing. So they're basically like an Uber, but for car wash. So they get the order, dispatch it to a independent car washer goes to the person's house or whatever, washes the car, done, right? Very limited menu, fixed prices. So we ended up saying, well, guys, it doesn't really make sense to have an LLM do this when you could just have a meta template, and all the person has to do is, when they're ordering, they just select from a menu and they just click on what they want, and that's it.
Don't spend tokens if you don't need to. Right. Yeah.
Right. So,
I mean, obviously contact centers get a lot of press now. It's low hanging fruit for AI. Everyone's doing the contact centers. I mean, you may not be able to share everything, but are you branching out into sort of marketing scenarios? Are you branching out into, retail or other areas of industry that are applicable to what you're doing? I guess because you've got to line it up with this sort of the voice part of it, where you can add that sweet spot for you, where you're adding the voice.
Yeah.
And then the semantics, as well as and there's a business opportunity here.
Yeah. So on the whole call center thing, one of the things that we realized was that the tech's not going to replace BPOs. So like the business process outsourcing companies that have call centers. Obviously, their business, right, is managing humans. They've got big, I hate to use the word this way, but it kind of helps understand. It's kind of like a fleet of humans that they're managing, right? And, sometimes they'll need less, sometimes they'll need more, depending on the business, right?
Yeah.
But these call centers, they use software. They use call center software. So it's oftentimes like cloud contact center software. Microsoft has that. Genesys has it. Vocalcom, you've got a couple of big actors that sell. In the US, you've got others as well. They sell this type of software, which allows you to actually do the calls, but it also does like recording of the calls, and it can give you high level kind of metadata analytics on these calls. To date, none of them actually had very good like transcription capabilities or analytics capabilities on top. This is something that they're now developing thanks to the boom of AI.
Yeah.
And what we realized was maybe our partners are not the call centers, but actually the contact center software guys, because they're building that software that they're already selling. They already have the distribution, but they don't necessarily have the teams in-house to kind of build all at once all the different features that they need. And so, there's an opportunity to come in and sell whatever expertise you have. So one of the things that they saw us obviously was for our local language capability, which kind of was is still a big differentiator compared to other companies doing similar things in chatbots and voice bots. So, there are different markets. We have enterprise companies that come to us because they want us to solve a business problem. So we come in and kind of, we build those flows, etc., for them. And then we pilot them, and then we, get commercial contracts, etc. But then you have these BPO / contact center software guys. They're more interested in the tech because they're already business experts, and they're kind of, what they're selling is a business solution to a problem, but they need certain tech capabilities. And so they come to us. And so we end up having this kind of business where we're building a product that solves a business problem, but we have APIs and a tech that we've sort of developed in order to build that solution, which we're now thinking, well, maybe we can actually license that as APIs or whatever to these actors so that they can integrate them into their solutions. And so it creates like a double revenue stream for us. And it also, this is an important point, it also associates us with bigger brands.
Yeah.
One of the issues we've had oftentimes with big enterprises, they're willing to test stuff with startups, but then they're very hesitant to go full on live with a startup because their thinking is, do I trust a youngish startup to actually own and kind of manage for me a core process of my business? This is a big hurdle that we have to get over.
I can see, because I was speaking to somebody who ran a contact center the other day for a large organization, and they said, moving forward, they were going down the BPO route, as many are. They said, moving forward, it's not about me knowing how to run a contact center and the customer experience and all that goes with it. It's me knowing how to run a BPO, right? A business process outsource. And what they meant by that was, they were obviously outsourcing everything, but they wanted to still retain control over their brand and what was happening in those BPO organizations. And to your point, putting the tech in that surface that is absolutely critical, because they're just managing QMS, quality management, right, of those BPOs. And it could be a number of BPOs in different countries, especially global brands.
Yeah.
but they've got to be able to be confident across the board that their brand's being represented correctly. They're not running contact centers because that's not their core business.
Yeah.
They've outsourced it, but conversely, you need that telemetry coming back in from those BPOs, and that's a big market now, I think. And to your point, it's making sure that's being surfaced to enable that to happen.
Absolutely. So QMS, quality monitoring software, is actually, so, I spoke about two things that we do. We've got the voice agents, and then we've got this back office analytics. So the back office analytics, the voice agents feed into that. But what we found was we were able to sell the kind of platform that does the analytics to companies that weren't necessarily interested in implementing AI agents immediately, but wanted the analytics side of things to run quality monitoring on human agents, and how they do calls. And so what we ended up doing was, we've got some customers who only use the analytics stuff, and it's still a bit early for them. They're not early adopters of like the AI agent stuff, but they are very interested in the QMS, so the quality monitoring software, because they realized that whereas before they used to have to get, especially for local languages, right? They'd have to get local speakers to come in, re-listen to like a small sample of calls, which is still very expensive for them. And then figure out what's going on the ground because they don't know what's going on the ground, right? Agents are going to write 3 words in their CRM and done. No one really knows what's being said. And so, the whole kind of business value of this analytics software was, well, now you can listen to 100% of your calls if you want. I mean, you don't have to. You can do 10%. That's more than what you're doing right now, which is not even 1% of calls. And you get insights, and when your agents are following brand guidelines, and when a call's not going well, etc. And so there's a whole kind of business around that, which we realized, and so then we thought, well, we could have that, but then plug in the voice agents, because voice agents are kind of the future. And we think that a lot of some of the calls that humans are taking today are going to be replaced by agents. Not all of them, but some of them. And so having a central QMS platform that can analyze, and again, we get back to this holistics name that we gave, that can give a holistic view of what AI agents are doing and what's going on there, but also what's going on the human side when humans are taking the call, gives a 360 view of what's going on in your customer interactions, essentially. So that's basically what we do today.
So we often talk about this sort of taking the toil out of businesses and human toil out with a view to humans in working on higher value sort of workloads, and it not being a case of replacing jobs, but actually it makes the ability for people to do things better, right? And we evolve as a group as a result. I think an analogy you used, which was I quite like, was the fact that we thousands of years ago we were lighting fires, right, by banging 2 flints together, and do we do that anymore? No, but we still are dependent on fire in certain aspects, right? I really talk a bit about that sort of evolution as you see it, and this sort of media hype of it's going to take all our jobs actually will just evolve as we have in history. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, so just maybe first on the part about AI taking jobs, and then I think companies are being very cautious in how they're actually talking about this. What I found is quite interesting is that as a startup in this space, right, when we talk to investors, they're all at least acting as though they're super bullish on the fact that AI is going to basically replace humans. Or contact centers won't exist tomorrow. Like AI is going to completely take that over, and it's creating this whole hype, right? And so investors then are saying, where are the AI companies working on this, and we want to invest, etc. But then when we talk to corporates who we work with, not the BPOs, but the corporates who are like the BPO's customers, right? Like they're the ones who buy BPO services. When you talk to them about this whole thing, right, they're very cautious to say AI is going to replace humans, because there's like this political will thing where you can't say that AI is going to replace humans. And so when we talk to them, we have to be, as a startup, quite cautious to say the intention isn't to replace humans. The intention is to augment humans, right? They like that because, especially, I mean, I feel like in the US and in the UK, it's a bit less like it's okay here. Like you can say that AI is going to replace humans, and everyone's sort of a bit more on board with the whole kind of market efficiency, capitalistic approach of, oh well, they'll just find jobs elsewhere and things are going to shift.
Yeah.
I think in continental Europe, in Africa, there's this political game where you can't really say that you're going to make people lose their jobs. And so you have to be very cautious about how you're buying software and like who your partners are and what their narrative is around that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very kind of, it's a balancing act between selling some of that to your investors as yes, some humans are going to be replaced. And I think that's true. I think there's a lot of like low hanging fruit tasks that humans shouldn't really be doing.
Yeah.
They're very repetitive,
habitual, right? We just do what we've always done.
Yeah.
Disruptor.
Exactly. And I think it's probably a good thing. I mean, to replace that with AI, even if, some people might lose, the way they earn their bread.
Yeah.
But I think to a certain extent, they're quite alienating jobs, which AI is just, it's just better if it does it. I think there are jobs where AI is just not there yet. And, AI is moving very fast. So I have to be cautious about what I'm saying. But I do feel like there's a lot of complexity, and we were talking about that earlier, right? Like where it's not just about understanding words, but there's a lot of, emotional intelligence and social intelligence and complexity in terms of reading cues and doing stuff, which requires more than just an LLM. You actually need a human to actually navigate that. Yeah. And I think those are the types of jobs that are not ready to be disrupted by AI today. There's another aspect to AI, which is that I think there are two things with AI, right? One is that, especially when talking about generative AI, because machine learning and stuff, that's kind of different.
Yeah.
But one of them is that, yes, there are certain tasks and even processes, if we want to make that distinction, that can be replaced by an AI agent. Some of them can't. And then there's another kind of value argument, which is to say, well, there's also a whole sphere where AI is just better than humans at doing this task. One of them is pattern recognition, which actually machine learning does too.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, if you've got like billions of parameters, a human will never be able to tell you with certitude what's going on.
Yeah.
Or like bring out the right insights.
Yeah.
But AI does.
Yeah.
So it's just a natural job for AI to do that augments the human.
We talked about radiography human, right? In one of the other sessions, radiography being a great example.
Yeah.
And we're actually, without it, we're just sort of tied. We can't do nearly as good a job. So,
absolutely, yeah.
And that's the augmentation part, right? I think. So I'm going to ask, this is Reese's favourite question. So this is, we ask everybody, which is, what do you think it takes to write a great agent, a great AI agent?
I think I'm going to say something very simple. It's going to seem very kind of, evident and obvious, but, it's amazing how sometimes when you're in sort of the heat of the sales and all that stuff, you kind of just overlook it, which is like, I think you just need to understand the scope of what you're doing and understand what exactly the process you're trying to do is. Because as I said earlier, you might not need an agent actually for a lot of these tasks. Once that's done, I think, one of the things we're experimenting with in the team, and it seems to be giving good results, is the whole kind of, I know that you've discussed this before, I think in previous podcasts, but it's having specialized agents in a kind of compound AI system. There are downsides to it. So again, you need to scope well. You need to understand how, you're going to be fitting those agents in and where failure might happen. So yeah, really, I mean, if I were to summarize it, I would say, I think the scoping work is probably the most important. If you understand very well what you're doing and what you're not doing with the agent, I think that's a really, really good starting point for building a solid production grade agent. because otherwise scope creep comes very quickly on agents. Your clients are always saying, oh yeah, it's doing sales, can you just add a customer support module on top? And you're like, maybe, but it's going to introduce noise into your agent, right? So, and scope creep is a big thing that can break your agent, I think, if you're not strict on what it does and what it doesn't do.
Sound advice. Like it. So sort of as we wrap up, I'd love to you to explain what next for ToumAI. In the next sort of 6, 12 months, whatever that you're able to share. So
so a few things. Firstly, as I said, we're working a lot on the enterprise segment. We will be announcing for Q2, so for the second quarter, around the time when there's a couple of big tech events happening in Morocco and in France, that we'll be launching a kind of self-serve platform for smaller companies, smaller businesses. So one of our objectives is, we saw kind of how it works with enterprise. We've learned a lot on the enterprise segment. We're keeping it. We still got the enterprise segment, but now we're thinking, actually, one of the big strengths of AI agents today is that it can help smaller businesses automate low-level tasks. And that's very high value for them in a way that it's not quite for big enterprises, because they've got more resources.
Right.
And so we'll be, unveiling, so to speak, a platform. You already got others like that. It's essentially an orchestration platform where you can build your own simple agents. We've, as I said, categorized different types of main use cases that these agents are good at.
Okay.
So it's kind of like low code. Yeah. And the objective is just to help business leaders who have, I don't know, like small and medium businesses to have, put agents into production for very concrete cases that they have that are much smaller in scope than what we're doing with enterprise, but very high value for them and very cheap compared to what they were doing before. So that's one thing that we're very excited for. And obviously we'll be doing it in mainstream languages, but we're also going to be doing it in local language as well. So the second thing, and this is more of a vision thing, this is more experimental and we're very excited for this, is that we are... When are you going to release this podcast? I'm just asking because I think in a couple of weeks we'll be able to we'll be able to disclose this. So, we've gotten some funding from GSMA, which is one of the kind of big telco associations that work with a lot of telcos, and we're very excited to be building the extension, what we see as the future of voice assistants on mobile apps. So what we're doing is, we've got these voice agents. For now, they kind of live, on a platform, and then we have to deploy them on different channels like WhatsApp or websites or, telephone call centers, that kind of stuff. What we're thinking now is, well, digital channels are becoming huge through like mobile phone apps, fintechs, banking, transport. They've all got apps today, right, where you can do stuff. And that's just going to keep, obviously, increasing. And one of the things that, we realized is, well, we could bring voice assistants onto an app such that anyone around the world, including those that are not digitally literate, not even necessarily literate, right? Like in certain parts of the world where literacy rates are still quite low, generationally a bit challenged, they're not used to doing stuff digitally. They have low trust in using apps. We could bring voice assistants onto an app. You speak to the voice assistant, it executes actions for you on the app.
Okay.
But it can also seamlessly act as a customer support agent, where, let's take an example, you want to wire funds, you're on your banking app, you want to wire funds to your friend. So you say that to the app, oh, I want to send this much to thingy. So it's going to execute that for you. But then you might be wondering, like, do I have a limit? Oh, do I have a limit on, how much I can wire? Like, did I put a limit on that? And it's going to give you the information based on the information it has on the app. Or you can even ask a general question like, I don't know, let's say you're banking with Barclays, you might say, oh, wait, is Barclays, open from this time to this time? I'm at this branch, and it's going to go and get the information, come back and answer you as though you had a human agent in front of you.
Okay. Okay.
And we see this as the future of customer support, where the first line of support, personalized support, is going to be on the app through a voice agent that speaks to you in a tone that is actually adapted to the brand,
Right.
in the language that you're most comfortable with. So that's really kind of where we're headed.
That's your hooking.
It's
That's
kind of
your
like the vision, that we're trying to go towards. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I look forward to that. Look, Youcef, thank you so much for coming in today and joining us. It's been a really good chat, and you did some fantastic things at ToumAI. It's really got some potential, I think. So
Thank you.
really appreciate you sharing that with us and sharing your views, especially around the linguistics part of it. That's fascinating. And I wish you all the best on that. So
Thank you so much. Appreciate being here. Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So want more great speakers like Youcef, please subscribe, and we'll keep them coming.